Imagine building one of the most successful real estate empires in the American West. Boardrooms, billion-dollar deals, a reputation that took decades to construct. Then imagine writing a check for a property that most serious people told you was a mistake. A ranch in Utah with a history that no due diligence process could fully account for. Brandon Fugal did it anyway, and what that decision has done to his life at 53 is the story nobody has fully told. Subscribe and stay until the very end. Brandon Fugal was not supposed to end up at Skinwalker Ranch. His trajectory, the one his professional history had been building across the decades before the purchase, pointed somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with corner offices and closing dinners and the specific kind of quiet power that successful commercial real estate in the Mountain West produces in the men who build it from scratch. He built Colliers International into one of the most dominant commercial real estate operations in the region, not through inheritance, not through institutional support, through the specific combination of strategic intelligence, relationship capital, and sustained professional execution that the commercial real estate business rewards in the people who are genuinely good at it. He was genuinely good at it. The deals he brokered, the properties he moved, the market position he established for his firm across a regional landscape whose major players he came to know, compete with, and in many cases outmaneuver across years of sustained professional engagement that produced a track record whose consistency distinguished him from the broader field of Mountain West commercial real estate operators. By the time he was in his 40s, Brandon Fugal had built the kind of professional reputation that most people in his industry spend entire careers working toward without reaching. Respected, connected, trusted, the kind of man whose phone calls get returned the same day, whose presence at a closing table communicates something specific about the quality of the transaction it is completing. That was the Brandon Fugal that the commercial real estate world of the Mountain West knew. The Brandon Fugal that the world knows now, the man whose name is synonymous with the most documented paranormal investigation in American television history, whose face appears on the History Channel's most watched paranormal franchise, whose decision to purchase a ranch in northeastern Utah and open its gates to a scientific investigation team and a broadcast production has consumed 5 seasons of the public's attention and reshaped his public identity in ways that the boardroom version of his life never could have produced, is a different person. Not different in character, not different in the discipline or the intelligence or the specific quality of considered resolve that his professional career established as his defining characteristics. Different in what he knows, and what he knows now at 53 that he did not know before the purchase is what the remaining years of his life will be shaped by whether he ever says it plainly or not. When Brandon Fugal bought Skinwalker Ranch in 2016, the people in his professional circle did not understand the decision, not in the ordinary sense of a business decision whose strategic logic was unclear. The commercial real estate industry had seen Fugal make counterintuitive moves before, and had learned across years of watching him operate that his instincts were worth taking seriously, even when the surface logic was not immediately apparent. They did not understand it in a more fundamental sense. The ranch had a reputation that predated the Bigelow ownership, stories that had circulated in the region for generations, a documented history of anomalous events that the NIDS program's prior investigation had engaged with seriously without resolving, a specific quality of place whose character the people who knew the land had communicated through the specific vocabulary of warning rather than of opportunity. The Sherman family had owned it and left in circumstances that the official account of the sale had never fully explained. Every prior program that had engaged seriously with what the ranch produced had eventually reached a point at which continuation became impossible. Brandon Fugal knew all of that before he signed. He had done his research. He had read what was available in the public record. He had engaged with the prior investigation history in enough depth to understand that what he was purchasing was not simply an undervalued piece of Utah real estate whose appreciation potential justified the investment. He was purchasing something whose full character he did not yet understand, and whose understanding, he believed, required the kind of sustained, resourced, scientifically credible investigation that neither the Sherman family nor the Bigelow operation had been able to fully execute. The purchase was not a real estate decision. It was a commitment, and the specific nature of what he was committing to, the financial investment, the personal exposure, the years of sustained engagement with phenomenon that his professional background had given him no framework for, the public identification with a subject that the professional world he had built his reputation in does not take seriously, and the specific personal toll that sustained proximity to the most anomalous property in American research history produces in the people who engage with it directly, was something that the people around him at the time of the purchase could not fully assess because Fugal himself could not fully assess it. He knew what the prior record indicated. He did not know what sustained direct engagement with what the ranch produced would do to a person. At 53, he knows. The knowing is what the past several years have been writing in the specific terms of what his life looks like now. Brandon Fugal built his professional identity across decades of work in an industry whose culture values discretion, measured communication, and the specific kind of institutional credibility that sustained success in commercial real estate produces in the people who achieve it. He was known as a straight shooter, a man whose word meant something and whose public statements reflected the careful consideration of someone who understood that reputation is the most valuable asset in his business and that every public communication either builds it or erodes it. He did not speak carelessly. He did not make claims he could not support. He did not attach his name to things he had not personally verified. Then he became the owner and public face of the Skinwalker Ranch investigation, and what that role required of him in terms of public communication was something that his prior professional experience had not prepared him for, and whose demands on his professional identity he has been managing visibly across every season of the broadcast record. He had to talk about things that the professional world he came from does not talk about. Aerial phenomenon whose aerodynamic characteristics his aerospace-credentialed scientific team could not account for within any known framework. Underground anomalies whose geometric consistency no geological model the investigation's consultants could construct accommodated. Electromagnetic events that disabled equipment with a timing and a specificity that ruled out random mechanical failure. Physical effects on crew members that medical professionals documented without being able to attribute to any known environmental cause in the area. He had to talk about these things publicly, on camera, in a broadcast format, with his name and his face and his professional reputation attached to every statement he made. For a man whose professional identity had been built on the careful, measured communication of a commercial real estate executive whose every public statement was assessed against the standards of an industry that values credibility above almost everything else. The specific exposure that the Skinwalker Ranch investigation's broadcast format required was a different category of professional risk than anything his prior career had demanded. It required him to be publicly associated with findings that his professional community would dismiss, and that the broader institutional scientific world would ignore. It required him to manage the ongoing negotiation between his professional identity's requirement for credibility and his personal commitment to the honest public representation of what the investigation was finding. He has managed that negotiation across 5 seasons of broadcast content with the specific discipline of a man who understood exactly what the stakes were when he accepted the role and who has never once suggested that the cost of accepting it was higher than the importance of what the investigation was documenting. But the management of that negotiation has its own cost, and at 53, the cost is visible in ways the broadcast format has never directly addressed. 5 seasons of Skinwalker Ranch investigation have produced a broadcast record that the paranormal television genre has never matched in the credibility of its scientific engagement or the sustained character of its evidence accumulation. That record has also produced something that the broadcast format's presentation of the investigation has never fully represented: the cumulative toll of sustained proximity to the most anomalous property in American research history, on the man whose ownership and whose public identification with the investigation has made him its most visible and most personally invested participant across every season of production. The toll is not dramatic in the acute sense of a single catastrophic event whose impact can be precisely dated and described. It is the quieter and more lasting toll of sustained exposure. Of 5 seasons of watching the investigation, he funded and organized and publicly championed produce findings whose implications his professional background in commercial real estate had given him no framework for processing, and that his sustained engagement with the ranch's scientific team across the production years has been building into an understanding whose full weight he has been managing carefully in every public communication he has made about what the investigation has found. His communication style has changed across the seasons. The Fugal of the early broadcast record is a man whose engagement with the investigation's anomalous findings is characterized by the specific quality of controlled professional curiosity, the posture of a businessman who has made a significant investment in a significant question and whose public communications about the question reflect the measured engagement of someone who is taking it seriously without yet having been fully changed by what taking it seriously produces. He was interested, he was engaged, he was applying the analytical framework of a successful commercial operator to findings that the framework was not designed to accommodate and discovering progressively across the early seasons, the specific points at which the framework's limitations became visible. The Fugal of the most recent seasons is different in a way that the broadcast record's most attentive viewers have been tracking without always being able to articulate precisely. The curiosity is still present, the engagement is still genuine, but something underneath both of those qualities has changed. The control is still there. His communication discipline has not been eroded by what the investigation has produced in him, but what the control is managing has changed. The curiosity has given way to something more specific, something heavier, the posture of a man who has moved from asking what is at Skinwalker Ranch to living with a partial understanding of the answer and managing that understanding in every public communication he makes about the investigation's progress. He chose to buy this property. He chose to open it to cameras. He chose to become the public face of its investigation. What he did not choose, what no amount of prior research or prior engagement with the investigation's history prepared him to choose, is what knowing what he now knows at 53 actually feels like to carry. Brandon Fugal's financial investment in the Skinwalker Ranch investigation is a dimension of the story whose specific character the broadcast format's presentation has never directly addressed, and that the public conversation about the investigation has engaged with only in the most general terms. He paid $40 million for the property. That figure has been reported widely and has become part of the public shorthand for describing the seriousness of his commitment to the investigation. What is less widely discussed, what the sustained operational costs of maintaining the investigation infrastructure, funding the scientific team's deployments, supporting the production relationship, absorbing the ongoing financial demands of a drilling operation whose equipment and personnel costs have accumulated across multiple seasons of progressive approach to the underground formation, and managing a property whose anomalous character makes its operational maintenance a fundamentally different proposition from the management of a conventional real estate asset have produced in cumulative terms, is the dimension of the financial story that the broadcast record's entertainment presentation has never been designed to address. The investigation is expensive in ways that the broadcast format does not represent. The monitoring infrastructure that runs continuously across the property, regardless of whether the production is actively filming, requires sustained operational funding. The scientific consultants whose professional engagements with the investigation's findings represent the franchise's primary claim to credibility require compensation commensurate with the credentials that make their involvement meaningful. The drilling operation has accumulated costs across its seasons of operation that the broadcast record's focus on the findings rather than the funding has kept largely out of the public conversation, and the ongoing management costs of a property that cannot be operated as a conventional real estate asset, whose specific character requires the sustained presence of specialized personnel and the maintenance of specialized infrastructure in addition to the standard operational costs of a working ranch, add a dimension to the investment's financial profile that the purchase price alone does not capture. Fugal has absorbed all of it with the sustained willingness of a man whose commitment to the investigation's progress he has consistently placed above the financial management discipline his professional background would otherwise demand. That sustained willingness, the decision, repeated across 5 seasons of accumulating operational costs to continue funding an investigation whose financial demands have not been offset by the commercial returns the broadcast relationship produces, is the least visible dimension of what the ranch has taken from Brandon Fugal at 53. And for a man whose professional identity was built entirely on the careful, disciplined management of financial risk across decades of commercial real estate operations, the specific nature of that willingness is perhaps the most revealing thing about what the Skinwalker Ranch investigation has done to the person who owns it. Brandon Fugal is a private man by the standards of someone whose professional profile has become as publicly visible as his involvement in the Skinwalker Ranch investigation has made it. His family, the personal dimension of his existence that lives entirely outside the broadcast framework of the investigation's public record, has been the aspect of what the ranch purchase has cost that he has been most careful about in every public communication about the investigation's personal impact. He does not discuss his family's relationship to the investigation in specific terms. He does not characterize what bringing home the sustained awareness of what the Skinwalker Ranch investigation has been finding has produced in the domestic context of a family whose life existed before the purchase and whose daily reality has been shaped by the purchase in ways that the broadcast record has never addressed. The broadcast record contains enough to establish the general character of what sustained ownership of and public identification with Skinwalker Ranch has required of his personal life, without providing the specific account that his privacy protects. The time commitment alone, the mental and emotional bandwidth that an investigation of this scope and this personal significance demands from the person who is simultaneously its funder, its public face, and its most invested participant, the specific quality of sustained engagement with findings whose implications for the nature of what the underground formation contains, for the nature of what operates in the airspace above the property, and for the broader questions about reality and human understanding that the investigation's most extreme findings point toward are not the kind of findings that a person sets aside when they leave the property and return to their family. They come home with you, the knowledge travels, and managing the weight of that knowledge in the context of a family life whose ordinary demands exist in productive tension with the extraordinary demands of a sustained paranormal investigation, whose most significant findings you are publicly associated with is a specific and sustained personal labor, whose cost the broadcast records focus on the investigation's scientific findings has never been designed to represent. At 53, Brandon Fugal is a man who carries the investigation home every time he leaves the ranch. What that carrying has produced in the personal dimension of his life, in the relationships, in the daily experience, in the specific quality of a domestic existence organized around someone whose professional identity has been so completely reshaped by a property that most of the world is still deciding whether to take seriously, is the chapter of his story at 53 that the cameras have never been pointed at. There is a specific burden that Brandon Fugal carries that no other person connected to the Skinwalker Ranch investigation carries in quite the same form. It is the burden of being the most credible voice for a subject that the institutional world he came from declines to credit. Travis Taylor carries the burden of a credentialed scientist whose professional identity is complicated by the public record of what his instrument data has been detecting. The production crew carries the burden of bearing witness to things they cannot fully discuss. But Fugal carries something different, the burden of a man whose commercial real estate success gave him a professional credibility that is entirely independent of the paranormal investigation world, and that he has voluntarily attached to the most significant and most contested paranormal investigation in American history. When he says something about the ranch, the weight of that professional credibility lands on the statement in a way that no prior figure in the paranormal television landscape has been positioned to produce. He is not a believer whose enthusiasm drives his claims. He is not a researcher whose institutional affiliation determines the reception of his findings. He is a commercially successful businessman whose relationship to the truth of the investigation's findings is governed by exactly the same standards of careful, credibility-protecting communication that his professional life has always demanded. And what that combination, the commercial real estate credibility and the Skinwalker Ranch public record, produces in the people who engage with his statements about the investigation is the specific quality of compelled attention that the paranormal television genre has never previously been able to generate in an audience that might otherwise dismiss it. He knows what that credibility is worth. He knows what attaching it to the investigation cost and what continuing to attach it across 5 seasons of broadcast content has continued to cost. At 53, having absorbed those costs across the full span of his ownership and his public identification with the investigation, the question of whether the cost has been worth it is one he has never answered directly. What he communicates through the careful management of every public statement he makes about the investigation's findings, what the specific quality of his communication across 5 seasons of increasing evidence accumulation says about where he is in his private assessment of that question, is the closest thing to an answer that 53 years of Brandon Fugal's life has produced. Brandon Fugal at 53 looks like a man who has been in proximity to something significant for long enough that the proximity has changed the man. Not in the dramatic and visible way that acute trauma changes people. In the quieter and more permanent way that sustained engagement with something that exceeds your prior framework for understanding the world changes the framework itself. He is still precise. He is still measured. He is still every professional thing that the commercial real estate career whose success preceded the ranch purchase established as his defining characteristics. But underneath the precision and the measurement and the professional discipline is something that was not there before 2016. A specific weight whose character the broadcast record captures in the most unguarded moments of his camera appearances, the moments between the deliberate public communications and the next carefully considered statement where the face of the man behind the professional identity is briefly visible. He looks like someone who knows more than he is saying, not because he is concealing information for strategic reasons. His commitment to the honest public representation of the investigation's findings has been consistent across every season of the broadcast record, but because what he knows, The complete picture of what 5 seasons of sustained investigation at the most anomalous property in American research history has produced in the man who has been most consistently and most personally invested in the investigation from its beginning is more than any broadcast format is equipped to contain. People who knew Fugal before the purchase have described the change in the terms that sustained proximity to extraordinary things produces in the people who acknowledge what they are experiencing rather than managing it into a more conventional framework. He is quieter about some things than he used to be, more specific about others. The professional confidence is intact, but the quality of what the confidence is resting on has changed. It used to rest on the specific and well-earned certainty of a commercially successful operator whose professional framework had been tested across decades of market engagement and had produced consistent results. At 53, it rests on something more complicated. The certainty of a man who has been close to something he cannot fully characterize, and whose sustained proximity to it has made him more careful rather than less about every word he uses to describe what it is. Brandon Fugal bought Skinwalker Ranch at 46. He is 53 now. 7 years of funding and organizing and publicly championing the most extensive paranormal investigation in American history. 7 years of financial cost, professional identity cost, and the specific daily cost of being the man whose name is most publicly associated with findings the institutional world he came from cannot receive. At 53, the question of what comes next is the question the broadcast record's future will answer. The ranch is still active. The drilling is still advancing. Whatever is underneath the mesa is still there, and the investigation is still getting closer. Fugal is still the man driving that approach, not because it has been easy or because the cost has been manageable, because he started something that the evidence requires him to finish, because the man who wrote the check to find out what was there has been close enough to the answer for long enough that stopping now would make everything it cost him mean nothing. That is 53 for Brandon Fugal, a man who bought a ranch and found something else entirely, and decided it was worth every dollar to find out what.